The market gate at Lashkar Gah came apart at 11 minutes past 1 in the afternoon. I want you to sit with that. Not the explosion. The time. 11 minutes past 1. Because somebody wrote that down. Somebody, in the middle of the worst afternoon of their life, looked at a watch and made a note of when the world ended. And that note is the reason I can tell you any of this at all. The dead don't keep records. The living do. And on that afternoon, in a tent made of olive drab canvas and aluminum poles 30 kilometers from where the bomb went off, the person keeping the records was a Navy nurse who, 4 hours earlier, had been told to hand a man his instruments and keep her mouth shut. Her name was Sahar Dowdy, Lieutenant, United States Navy, Nurse Corps. And before I tell you what she did, I have to tell you what a man said to her, because the two things don't make sense apart. It was morning. The Roll 2 surgical post was quiet the way those places get quiet. Not empty, just waiting. There's a smell to those tents. Diesel from the generators bleeding in under the flaps. Iodine. The plastic and cold smell of saline bags stacked in their cardboard. Coffee that's been on a hot plate since before dawn and tastes like it. Dowdy was checking the trauma bay, the way she did every morning, running her hand along the edge of the gurney rails, counting the chest tubes, the cricothyrotomy kits, the tourniquets hanging on their hooks like she was counting children before a school trip. She did it every morning. Nobody told her to. She just did it. And a man walked in who'd flown in the night before. His name was Errol Whitcomb, civilian contract surgeon. A good one. On paper, 20 years of trauma work in Johannesburg, then Houston, then wherever the money and the war was. He had hands like a concert pianist and a reputation that arrived before he did. He'd never worked a combat mass casualty in his life, but nobody tells you that part when they hand you the file. You read 20 years of trauma, and you think you know what a man can do. He looked at Dowdy. He looked at her blue scrubs. And he made the calculation that men like him have been making for as long as there have been women in rooms where decisions get made. You're the nurse, he said. Not a question. A placement. He was putting her on a shelf. She said, "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Dowdy. I run the trauma bay." And he smiled. And here's the thing. It wasn't even a cruel smile. That's what made it worse. It was a patient smile. A teaching smile. The smile a man gives when he's about to explain the obvious to someone he's decided is slow. "Let me tell you how this works, Lieutenant," he said. "When the casualties come, I cut. You hand me what I ask for. You don't talk during a procedure. A surgical theater isn't a democracy. One voice. Mine. We clear." I've read the statements from 3 people who were in that tent. A corpsman named Tully. The anesthetist, a Navy lieutenant named Brandt. And Dowdy's own after-action, written in a hand so steady you'd never know what it was written about. All 3 of them remember it the same way. They remember she didn't argue. She didn't flush. She didn't do any of the things you'd want her to do, the things that would have felt good to watch. She said, "Understood, sir." And she turned back to counting the tourniquets. Tully, the corpsman, a kid from Ohio, 22 years old, wrote that he wanted to say something. He wrote, and I'm quoting him, "I knew what she was and he didn't, and I wanted to tell him, but it wasn't my place." He was 22 and he understood something the surgeon with 20 years of trauma didn't. He understood that the most dangerous person in any room is usually the one who isn't talking. Because here's what Whitcomb didn't read in the file. Here's what the file didn't say, because the file was about a nurse and this part of her life belonged to a different file, in a different building, under a different name. Before Sahar Dowdy ever pulled on a pair of blue scrubs, she'd spent 6 years as something else entirely. She'd carried men. Not metaphorically. Physically. She'd run across open ground with another human being's weight on her back, and other people trying to kill them both. She'd learned where the body comes apart before she ever learned how to put it back together. She knew the order in which men die, which is a different and older knowledge than the order in which you operate on them. And she learned it the only way anybody ever really learns it, which is by being there when it happened and not being able to stop it. The hospital was the second act of her life. The surgeon thought he was looking at the only act there was. Let me tell you who she was before the tent. Her father was a physician. I want to get that right, because it matters, and because I've told too many stories where the father works with his hands and says one quiet thing at a kitchen table. And that's a true kind of story, but it's not this one. Tarek Dowdy was a doctor in Casablanca, an internist, a man who wore a tie to dinner and quoted poetry he expected his children to recognize. He came to Detroit in 1986 with a wife, 2 suitcases, and a medical degree that the United States of America did not, at first, recognize as worth anything at all. So a man who'd run a clinic in Morocco spent his first 4 American years driving a cab and studying for board exams at red lights. And by the time Sahar was born, he was a physician again, a real one, in a real clinic on the east side of Detroit, treating people who paid him in cash or in casseroles or in nothing at all. He did not raise his daughter to be quiet. That's the part that surprises people. He raised her to argue. Dinner in the Dowdy house was a courtroom. You stated your position, you defended it. Your father took it apart. And if you cried, he simply waited until you were finished and then asked you to continue. By the time she was 12, Sahar Dowdy could hold a position against a grown man and not blink. By the time she was 16, she could win. So when I tell you, she said, "Understood, sir," to a surgeon who just told her not to talk. I need you to understand that silence wasn't fear. Her father had taught her that the loudest thing in any argument is the position you haven't shown yet. You don't spend your ammunition on a man who isn't the battle. You wait for the battle. The battle was coming. It was 30 kilometers away, and it didn't know her name yet. She'd told her father she was joining the Navy on a Sunday, after church. He wasn't a church-going man, but he liked the music, so he'd sit in the back and listen. She told him in the car. She'd expected the argument of her life. Instead, her father drove 3 blocks in silence, which from him was louder than shouting. And then he pulled over and turned off the engine and said, "You'll see things I can't fix in my clinic. You understand that? There are things that happen to people that no clinic on the east side of Detroit will ever show you." And she said yes. And he said, "Then go where they are. A doctor who's never seen the worst of it is only half a doctor. Go see it. Come back and tell me." And then he started the car and drove the rest of the way home and never spoke of it again. And 4 years later, when she got her commission, he flew to her ceremony in a suit and stood in the back, the way he stood in the back of the church, listening. That's the man who raised the woman in the blue scrubs. But the Navy doesn't make you a nurse first. That's the thing the surgeon's file left out. Sahar Dowdy went in on an enlistment, not a commission. She wasn't an officer yet. She was 18 and angry at the world in a way she couldn't have explained. And she didn't want to wear a tie like her father. She wanted to be where the things her father couldn't fix were actually happening. So she went corpsman, hospital corpsman, United States Navy, which, if you don't know, is the rating that gets attached to the Marines. The Navy doesn't put medics in Marine rifle companies. It puts corpsmen. And a corpsman with a Marine infantry battalion is not a person who hands instruments to surgeons in a clean tent. A corpsman with a Marine infantry battalion is the person who runs toward the screaming. 2 deployments. The first one she doesn't talk about. The second one is the one that made her. Ramadi, 2006. I've stood in that city, not then, but after, and there is nothing about it that prepares you for what it was. Dowdy was 19, then 20, attached to a line company, the only woman most of those Marines had ever taken a bullet near. And they did not, at first, want her. Of course they didn't. A 19-year-old. A girl. They had names for her that I won't repeat, the kind of names men use when they've decided you're a liability they're going to have to carry. She earned it the way you always have to earn it, which is the worst possible way. A Marine named Cobb stepped on a pressure plate on a route they'd walked 100 times, and the bottom half of him stopped being the bottom half of him. And the Marines who'd had names for her froze the way human beings freeze. And a 19-year-old girl from Detroit went into the smoke and the screaming on her knees and put 2 tourniquets on what was left of Cobb's legs and kept him alive with her hands and her mouth and her whole body for the 11 minutes it took the bird to come. Cobb lived. Cobb is alive right now. He runs a hardware store in Tennessee, and he named his daughter Sahar, and most of his customers have no idea why. After Cobb, the name stopped. After Cobb, she wasn't the girl. She was document. And in a Marine rifle company, there is no higher word than document. They will die for document. They have. So she learned it. She learned the thing the surgeon would never learn from 20 years in clean trauma bays in cities where the ambulances come. She learned triage, not the textbook kind, the real kind, the kind you do on your knees in the dirt with 5 men down and 2 minutes and not enough hands, where you have to look at a man you know, a man whose kids' names you know, and decide that he's going to die so that 2 others can live. She learned which wounds lie to you. She learned that the quiet ones are the ones that kill you, that the man screaming is the man who can still breathe, and the man who isn't making any sound at all is the man you've already lost or are about to. She learned where the body comes apart and in what order it gives up. That knowledge is older than surgery. It comes from the battlefield, not the operating room, and the two are not the same place even when they're in the same tent. When she got out the first time, her father asked her the question he'd asked 4 years earlier in the car. "Did you see it?" And she said yes. And he said, "Now what?" And that's when she told him she was going back to school. Nursing, then a commission. She wanted to come back, not as the kid running into the smoke, but as the one who decided. The one in charge of the trauma bay. The Navy paid for it. She earned the bars. Lieutenant Dowdy. And in the spring of 2011, they sent her back to the war to a Role 2 surgical post in Helmand Province to run the trauma bay, which she'd been doing for 6 weeks, perfectly, when a civilian surgeon flew in overnight, looked at her blue scrubs, and told her not to talk. That was the morning. The bomb was at 11 minutes past 1. I'll tell you about the bomb, but I want to leave you for a moment exactly where the people in that tent were left, not knowing. Going about a quiet morning. Dowdy counting tourniquets. Whitcomb scrubbing in for a routine procedure, pleased with himself, certain he understood the room he was standing in. Tully the corpsman wishing he'd said something. Brant the anesthetist reading a paperback. A generator humming. Coffee going stale. And 30 kilometers away, at the market gate at Lashkar Gah, a man was driving a car packed with explosive toward a crowd of people buying bread. The first word came over the radio at 1:14. Mass casualty. Inbound. That's all it was, at first. 2 words and a crackle of static and the particular tone in a radio man's voice that everybody in that tent had learned to read. Tully wrote that he knew before the words finished. He wrote, "You can hear the number and how they say it. A bad day sounds different than a normal one before they ever give you the count. And this one sounded different. Then the count came. And the count was wrong, because the count is always wrong at the start. But even the wrong count was bad. 8, the first voice said. Then it was 12. Then somewhere in the chaos of the casualty collection point 30 kilometers away, a Marine with a radio and a clipboard counted again and said 14, and that was the number that stuck. 14 wounded. A vehicle-borne device at the market gate. Civilians, an ANA, and 2 Marines from the security detail caught in the blast radius, and all of them coming to one Role 2 surgical post with 2 surgeons and a trauma bay built, on a good day, to handle 3 at a time. I need you to understand the arithmetic of that. 2 surgeons, 2 tables, 14 people whose bodies were trying to die. The math doesn't work. The math is never going to work. And in a situation where the math doesn't work, the most important person in the room is not the one with the scalpel. It's the one who decides whose body gets to keep trying. That's triage. And triage is not surgery. They are different skills, and a man can be a genius at one and a child at the other. Whitcomb had been scrubbing for a routine procedure when the call came. Tully wrote that he stopped, water running over his hands, and looked toward the radio, and that for a moment, just a moment, the certainty went out of his face. Because 20 years of trauma in Houston is real, it's a real and hard thing. But in Houston, the casualties come one at a time in an ambulance with a paramedic who's already done the first triage on the way, and you have a whole hospital behind you, and you have time. Here there was no hospital behind him. Here the casualties were going to arrive all at once, in the back of whatever could carry them, in a state that civilian trauma rarely sees, and there would be no time, and the first decision, the decision that would determine how many of the 14 were alive at sundown, had to be made in the 60 seconds after the first vehicle stopped. Brant, the anesthetist, wrote one line about that minute that I've never been able to shake. He wrote, "I watched the surgeon realize he didn't know what to do, and then I watched the nurse decide that she did." The first vehicle came in at 1:31, then a second, right behind it. Then the worst sound there is, which is not screaming. Screaming is fine, screaming is good, screaming means a working airway. The worst sound is many people screaming and underneath it the ones who aren't. And this is the moment. This is the whole story, really. The rest is just before and after. A man had stood in that tent 5 hours earlier and told Sahar Dowdy that a surgical theater was not a democracy, that there was one voice, and the voice was his, and that she was not to talk. The casualties hit the entrance of the tent, and Whitcomb stood frozen at the edge of it. Not from cowardice, I want to be fair to the man, from the simple paralysis of a person whose every instinct was built for a different kind of disaster. And into that silence, Into the half-second of nothing before everything came apart, Sahar Dowdy talked. She didn't shout it. That's the part everybody remembers. You'd think she'd have screamed. She didn't. Her father had taught her that the man who raises his voice has already lost the argument. She pitched it low and flat and absolutely certain, the voice of someone who has done this on her knees in the dirt at Ramadi, and it cut through the noise the way a low sound does when everything else is high. Bay's mine, she said. Triage is mine. Nobody touches a patient till I tag him. And then she was moving. I've read all 3 accounts of the next 90 seconds and they don't fully agree because nobody who was there had time to watch. They were all inside it. But I've put them together the way you put together a bone from fragments. And this is what she did. She went to the first man on the ground and she did not look at his face. That's a thing the textbooks don't tell you and the battlefield does. You do not look at the face first because the face will lie to you and the face will break your heart and you don't have time for either. She looked at his chest. Rise and fall. Rise and fall. Good. Breathing. And then at the dark spreading under him. And her hand was already at his thigh finding the bleed. And she said one word. P1. Table. And the corpsman moved him. And she was already on her knees beside the next one. The next one was quiet. I told you about the quiet ones. A young ANA soldier. No more than 17. No obvious wound. Sitting up. Calm. And a green surgeon would have walked past him toward the screaming. Dowdy stopped. She put 2 fingers on his neck and her other hand flat on his belly, and she felt what was happening inside him that you couldn't see from the outside. The slow filling, the body going still because it was running out of the blood it needed to panic with. P1, she said. This one first. He's bleeding inside. Wickham, this one. Now. And here's the thing. Here's the thing that turned the whole tent. Wickham moved. The surgeon who'd told her not to talk. He heard the nurse give him an order with another man's name in it, and some part of 20 years of trauma recognized. In the flat certainty of her voice, the one thing a surgeon learns to trust faster than anything else, which is competence. He didn't argue. There wasn't time, and there wasn't a reason. He took the quiet boy to the table because the woman in the blue scrubs told him to. And on the table, they opened the boy up and found exactly what she'd felt with the flat of her hand. A torn vessel filling the abdomen, 90 seconds from killing him, and they clamped it. And the boy is a grown man now in Helmand with children of his own who will never know that a nurse from Detroit who never saw his face read his death off the surface of his skin and refused it. She kept moving. The whole tent was moving now, but it was moving around her. And that's the thing about real command. It doesn't look like command. It looks like everyone suddenly knowing where to be. P1 to the tables. P2 to the cots. Stabilize. Wait. And then the worst one, the one I think about most, because it's the one that tells you who she really was. There was a man, a Marine, one of the security detail, who was screaming. Loud, conscious, terrible to hear. And every instinct in that tent, in every person who wasn't her, pulled toward the screaming, because the screaming is unbearable and you want to make it stop. Dowdy knelt by him for 3 seconds, felt him, looked at what the blast had done, and then she did the hardest thing there is. She tagged him expectant. That word, expectant, it's a soft word for a brutal thing. It means, this man is going to die, and we do not have the hands or the time or the blood to change that. And if we try, 2 others will die in the minutes we spend failing to save him. It means you look at a screaming, living, conscious human being, and you decide he is already gone. It is the loneliest decision a human being can make, and there is no one to share it with, and there is no medal for it. There has never been a medal for it, because the country cannot bear to admit that the decision exists. She made it. She'd made it before, in the dirt at Ramadi, and it had never once gotten easier. And Tully, the corpsman, the 22-year-old, wrote that as she stood up from that Marine, he saw something cross her face for half a second, just half a second, and then it was gone and she was on to the next one. He wrote, she didn't get to keep that face on. There wasn't time to keep it on. And then he wrote a line I'm going to read you exactly as he wrote it, because it's the truest thing anybody said about that day. I understood right then that her job that afternoon was to be the one who carried the decisions nobody else could live with. So the rest of us could just do our hands. So the rest of us could just do our hands. That's what she did for the next 4 hours. She held the whole shape of it in her head. 14 people, 2 tables, the blood supply running down, the order of operations, who could wait and who couldn't, and who'd crossed the line from couldn't wait to too late. And she gave the orders, and the surgeons did the cutting, and the corpsmen did the carrying, and not one of them, not once in 4 hours, questioned the voice that had been told that morning not to talk. By the second hour, Whitcomb wasn't even waiting for her. He'd finish a patient, look up, and she'd already have the next name and the reason, and he'd nod and take them. The man had stopped being the voice. He'd become a pair of hands. The best pair of hands in the tent. I want to be fair, his hands were extraordinary. He saved lives in there with those hands that nobody else could have saved. But a pair of hands, pointed where the mind in the blue scrubs told them to point. Outside, the light was going long and orange across the dust. Inside, a woman from the east side of Detroit was doing the thing her father told her to go do. All those years ago in the car. She was standing where the things he couldn't fix were happening. And she was fixing what could be fixed and carrying what couldn't, and not letting anyone see her do the carrying. The last patient came off the table a little after 5. And then the tent got quiet again. A different quiet, the wrung-out quiet that comes after. And Sahar Dowdy did the thing that, more than the triage, more than the orders, more than the boy she saved by the touch of her hand, is the reason I'm able to tell you any of this at all. She found a pen, and she found the laminated triage cards, and she sat down on an empty crate at the edge of the bay while the corpsmen were still mopping, and she wrote down 14 names. Not the official record. There was an official record. There always is. The Navy generates paper the way the war generated dust. The official record went up the chain, got filed, got summarized into a line in a monthly report that said the Roll 2 received 14 casualties on such a date, and that 12 survived to evacuation. 12 of 14. In a civilian trauma center on a normal day with one patient at a time, 12 of 14 would be a tragedy. In a tent with 2 tables and no time and a triage call made on the surface of a boy's skin, 12 of 14 is something close to a miracle, and the official record described it in one flat sentence and moved on. That's not the record Dowdy made. She wrote each name in her own hand on the triage card it belonged to. Next to each name she wrote the tag. P1, P2, and next to one of them, the Marine, the screaming one, the word she'd had to choose. EXP. And then she did the thing that I've thought about more than almost anything else in this whole story. She did not write her own name anywhere on those cards. There's no signature. 14 names, the tags, the date, the time, 11:14, when the radio first spoke, 1:31, when the first vehicle stopped, and no signature underneath. The woman who held the entire afternoon in her head, who decided who lived and who could not be saved, who turned a surgeon into a pair of hands by the flat certainty of her voice, left herself off the page. Tully asked her about it, weeks later. He wrote that he finally worked up the nerve, and he asked her why she didn't sign the cards, and she looked at him like he'd asked a strange question, and she said, and this is Tully's memory, written down that same year. She said, the cards aren't about me. They're about them. My name on it would just be in the way. My name would just be in the way. I've turned that over for a long time. And I think, I'm not certain, I never met her, I'll get to that. I think it's the most honest thing in the whole record. Because the country has a hard time with people like that. The country wants a name. It wants a face for the medal, a story with a hero standing in the middle of it. And when it can't find one, it gets uncomfortable and looks away. And here was a woman who'd done the thing the medals are supposed to be for, and who'd looked at the cards and decided that putting her own name on them would crowd out the names that mattered. That's not modesty. Modesty is a performance. This was something else. This was a person who'd carried the decisions nobody else could live with, and who understood, in her bones, that the carrying was the job, and the job did not include credit. The job included silence. So let me tell you about Whitcomb, because he's the only one who tried to fix it. He came to her that night. After, when the tent was clean and the surviving 12 were stabilized or evacuated, and the 2 who didn't make it were where the ones who don't make it go. Brant wrote that he saw it happen, saw the surgeon walk over to the nurse, the man who'd told her not to talk walking over to the woman whose orders he'd followed for 4 hours, and Brant wrote that he expected, I don't know, an apology, a speech. There wasn't one. Whitcomb wasn't a man for speeches. He stood next to her for a second, and then he asked her one question. He asked, where did you learn triage like that? And she told him, not all of it. She didn't tell him about Cobb or the names the Marines had for her or the 11 minutes in the smoke. She just said, "Before I was a nurse, sir, I was a corpsman. 2 pumps with the Marines. I learned where they die before I learned how to keep them from it." And Brant wrote that Whitcomb was quiet for a moment. And then he said the thing that's the closest thing to an apology in the whole record. And it's better than an apology, because an apology would have been about him, and this wasn't. He said, "I read your file. It said nurse." And she said, "The file's right. I'm a nurse." And he said, "The file left some things out." And she said, and you can hear her father in this, "The man who taught her that you don't spend your ammunition on a man who isn't the battle." She said, "Files usually do, sir." That was it. That was the whole reckoning. No drama. No speech. A man learned, in 4 hours, what 20 years of his own competence had blinded him to. And the learning showed up not in words, but in the next mass casualty. 3 weeks later, 11 more wounded. And Brant wrote that this time, the second the call came, before anyone said anything, Whitcomb turned to Doughty and said 5 words. Brant wrote them down. The surgeon said, "Lieutenant has triage." I cut. That's the apology. Lieutenant has triage. I cut. A man who'd announced on his first morning that there was one voice in the theater, and it was his, standing in the entrance of the tent 3 weeks later, telling the room that the voice belonged to her, and that he was the hands. He'd figured out the thing it takes some men their whole lives to figure out, and most men never do. That being the best in the room at one thing does not make you the most important person in the room, and that the secure man, the truly good one, is the one who can look at someone better than him at the thing that matters most in that moment and hand them the room. He did that. I'll give him that. For the rest of this, I'll give him that. He was wrong on the first morning in the ugliest way a man can be wrong. And then he did the hardest thing a wrong man can do, which is change in front of the people who watched him be wrong. But I don't want to leave you with the surgeon. The surgeon's redemption is a nice thing, and it's a small thing, and it's not what this is about. This is about the woman who wrote 14 names and didn't sign them. So let me tell you what happened to her. And let me tell you how I know. Sahar Doughty did 3 more years. She ran trauma bays, Helmand, and then a hospital ship, and then a training command back in the States where she taught young Navy nurses the thing you can't teach from a book, the triage that comes from the dirt and not the classroom. The young ones loved her and were terrified of her in the exact proportion that means a teacher is doing it right. She made full lieutenant commander. And then, in 2016, she did the quietest thing in this whole quiet story. She got out. No drama. No scandal. No injury that forced her hand. She'd done her time. She'd done it completely. She'd given the war everything the war was owed and not one thing more. And then she folded up the uniform and went home to Detroit. And she went to work as a trauma nurse at a hospital not 3 miles from the clinic where her father, older now, slower, but still in his tie, still saw patients who paid him in cash or casseroles or nothing. She didn't tell the hospital what she'd done. Why would she? She was the best trauma nurse they had. The one the doctors learned, after a while, to listen to in the bad moments. And most of them never knew that the calm in her voice when the bay filled up had been forged in a tent in Helmand with 2 tables and 14 names. She just did her hands and carried what needed carrying and went home at night to a city she loved and a father who'd been right about everything all those years ago in the car. That's where she is. As far as I know, that's where she is right now. Alive, working, quiet. The kind of life that doesn't make it into any record at all, which is exactly the life she'd want, I think. So here's the question I can't answer, and I'm not going to pretend I can. If she never signed the cards, if she never told the hospital, never told anyone, then how do I know? How does any of this get to me? To you? To this record we're making right now? I'll tell you in the last part. Because the answer is the only part of this story that has my own name in it. I never met Sahar Doughty. I want to say that plainly, because everything I've told you, I had to dig for, and the dirt I dug it out of is the only honest place to end. I found the boy first. Not the boy, he's a man now. The 17-year-old NA soldier she read off the surface of his skin, the one she sent to the table by touch alone. He's in his 30s, in Helmand, and a few years back somebody recorded an oral history of locals who'd worked with the coalition, and his is in there, translated. He doesn't know her name. He never knew her name. He just knows there was a woman in blue who put her hand on his stomach when everyone else was running past him, and that her hand is the reason his children exist. He said one thing the translator kept word for word. He said, She did not look at my face. I was angry about it for years. Then a doctor explained to me why. She did not look at my face because she was reading the rest of me. The face is the last thing that tells the truth. A 17-year-old's grudge turned into the truest description of triage I've ever read, by a grown man who finally understood what saved him. That's the thread I pulled. One man's testimony, no name attached. And from there it was the slow work, the kind I do, the kind nobody pays for. A roll to unit history. A date. A casualty summary that said 14 received, 12 evacuated, and not one word about how. The how is never in the summary. The how is the part the paper can't hold. But Tully kept a journal. Hospital corpsman Daniel Tully, 22 years old that afternoon, from Ohio. He kept a journal the whole deployment, the way some kids do when they can't say out loud what they're seeing, and years later, an older man now, he donated it to a small oral history project at a Navy medicine archive, the kind of place that holds the things the big archives don't have room for. And in Tully's journal is the morning, and the surgeon's voice, and the 4 hours, and the line I read you. So the rest of us could just do our hands. He wrote her name. He wrote it the way a kid writes the name of someone he'll measure every other person against for the rest of his life. And Brandt, the anesthetist, I found him too. Alive, retired, willing to talk. He's the one who gave me the 5 words. Lieutenant has triage. I cut. He's the one who told me about the second mass casualty, 3 weeks later, and the surgeon turning to her before anyone spoke. I asked Brandt what happened to Wickham. He said the man went home eventually, kept doing contract work, and that he heard, years on, that Wickham used to tell young surgeons one story when he was teaching, about a tent in Helmand, and a nurse he'd told not to talk. In the afternoon, he learned that the most important person in the room is almost never the one holding the knife. Brandt said Wickham never used her name when he told it. Said he always called her the lieutenant who taught me. I think that was the man's penance and his thanks, both folded into one careful sentence he repeated for the rest of his working life. So I had the witnesses. I had the boy, and the corpsman's journal, and the anesthetist's memory. What I didn't have was her. I wrote to her. I found the hospital in Detroit, and I wrote a careful letter, the kind I've written too many times, the kind that says I'm not here to take anything. I just want to put your name where it belongs before there's no one left to put it. I told her what I knew. I told her about the boy in Helmand who's alive. I asked if she'd talk to me. She wrote back. 3 lines. I have the letter. I'm not going to read you all of it, because some of it was hers and meant for me, but I'll read you the part that I think she'd let me share, because it's the part that's about everyone and not just her. She wrote, I'm grateful you found the boy alive. That's worth more than the rest of it. But I'd rather you didn't use my name. The 12 who walked out of that tent, that's the record. I was just the one who kept the list. I was just the one who kept the list. So I didn't use her name. The name I've been saying isn't hers. I changed it, the way I change all of them, because she asked, and because a person who spends her whole life refusing to crowd out the names that matter has earned the right to keep her own off the page. Sahar Dowdy is a name I made to carry a true thing. The true thing is the afternoon. The true thing is 12 of 14. The true thing is a woman who was told not to talk, who waited, and who spoke exactly once, when it counted, in a voice that turned a surgeon into a pair of hands. But there's an object. There's always an object, if you dig long enough, and this one I can show you, because it's hers and it's not. That laminated triage card. The one she wrote on the crate at the edge of the bay, 14 names in her own hand, the tags, the date, and no signature underneath. It survived. Tully kept it. He took it before it could go in a burned bag with the rest of the day's paper, because at 22 he understood it was the realest document in that tent, realer than the summary that went up the chain. He kept it for years, and when that little Navy medicine archive started taking donations, he gave them the journal and he gave them the card, and the card is behind glass now, in a quiet case in a quiet building most people will never visit. 14 names. The tags, the P1S, the P2S, and the one that says EXP, the Marine, the screaming one, the decision she carried out of that tent and never set down. The date, the times, 11/14, 1:31. And under all of it, where a signature would go, where the country wants a name so it can hang a medal on it, there's nothing. Just an empty space and 14 names that aren't hers. I've stood in front of that case. I read every name. I couldn't read hers, because hers isn't there, And that's exactly how she wanted it. And I think it might be the most honest war record I've ever seen. A list of the saved, kept by the one who decided, signed by no one. So here's what I'll leave you with. Not an answer. I don't have the answer to this one. There's a woman in Detroit right now, 3 miles from her father's old clinic, working a trauma bay, and the doctors there have learned to listen to her in the bad moments, and most of them have no idea why her voice goes so flat and so certain when the room fills up with blood. She'll never tell them. She kept the list, and she didn't sign it, and she went home. How many of them are there? How many people walking around right now, in your town, at your hospital, behind some counter, who once held an afternoon like that in their head and decided who lived, and then folded it up and carried it home and never said a word because they decided their name would just be in the way? I don't know. I can't count what won't be counted. But I kept this one. It's on the wall behind glass, 14 names and an empty space. You've read it now. So have I. Say one of those names today if you want. Doesn't matter which. They burn the same.